Captain Smith shot down 4 ramps himself that day, and Captain Marion Carl shot down 3, but as of noon on August 30th, there were only 5 operational F-4F fighters on the ground at Henderson Field. That day, the fighter mission against the Burrows was followed by a bomber mission to soften up the airfield in preparation for a landing again that night. Just after 3 o'clock, 18 Bettys appeared high overhead, and the 5 F-4Fs were not yet refueled by the laborious hand operation needed, nor rearmed, so they could not take off. For once the Bettys were not interested in the airfield, but in the ships in the Sound. The Barrows was on the far side, and the destroyer transport Calhoun was on the Guadalcanal side with the destroyer transport Little, and the auxiliary Capara delivering a load of supplies to the badly depleted dumps of the Marines. The Bettys came in high and bombed precisely, and the Calhoun was surrounded by near misses and some hits, and within 2 minutes she sank with 51 of her crew. That night the Tokyo Express ran again, and the first of General Kawaguchi troops were landed, a battalion carried by 3 destroyers. What General Vanda feared, the successful build-up of Japanese land forces on Guadalcanal, had begun. And thereafter, for the next 2 weeks almost nightly, the Rat Patrol sneaked in under cover of darkness to land troops in the Japanese zones of the island. For the moment the Japanese were not moving, but when they had brought in enough men, Vandergrift could expect the land battle to begin. In the last few days of August, wheels began to move that would bring Vandergrift's desperate situation to the attention of higher commands. In a most positive way, a short, wiry man with the look of a retired prizefighter showed up dressed in keys as Numa, and insisted on going forward to investigate the situation in the South Pacific. Gormley, who had never bothered to do this himself, sent the man along with sufficient escort, and that is how Under-Secretary of the Navy James Fifth Forstall came to learn the grim facts of the Guadalcanal undertaking at the beginning of September. He flew back to Pearl Harbor to report with horror on the desperate conditions he had found, and then went on to Washington to begin stirring up the political animals who controlled the flow of supply to Europe and the Pacific, immediately after Forrest's visit. Promises of assistance came from Pearl Harbor and from Army commands across the Pacific, but help was to come quickly in a manner not quite envisaged by any of the High Command on August 29th. Rear Admiral George D. Murray arrived to join Admiral Fletcher, and his task force built around the Hornet brought the American carrier contingent back to 3 as usual. Admiral Fletcher was talking about the need to refuel, so Gurley ordered him to send 1 task force to Numa for oil and resupply on Guadalcanal. The situation on August 30th nearly warranted panic as General Vandergrift contemplated the 5 working fighters on the field and the sinking of the Calhoun without an American plane getting into the air to try to defend it. The feeling of desperation was strong, but that very afternoon small craft brought across from Tulagi several loads of parts for the planes from the grounded Burrows. In the next few hours more parts could have been unloaded, but in the sense of urgency many were jettisoned over the side in the belief that the ship had to be lightened and gotten off the reef before the Japanese came back to do to her what they had done to Calhoun. Scarcely had the Calhoun settled to the floor of Iron Bottom Sound when the sound of engines was heard over the island again. The Marines were ready to wince, but then began to shout, when above them they saw the familiar blue and white stars and the grey wings of the F-4F's 19 new F-4Fs and 12 SBDs landed on Henderson Field to be surrounded by grateful well-wishers. These planes represented the other 2 squadrons of Marine Air Group 23, and one of them carried the commander of the group, Colonel William Wallace. Among the greeters was Rear Admiral McCain, the commander of land-based air forces in the South Pacific. On a fact-finding trip of his own 3 weeks had gone by since the invasion, and neither Admiral G. formerly nor Admiral Turner had recognized the full extent of the D anger, although both were aware of the precarious foothold of the Marines and the supply problem. But after one look at the situation and a talk with Vandergrift, Admiral McCain sent Nimitz a blunt message. The enemy had planned Guadalcanal as a major airbase, and they seemed to be determined to get it back. He said the Americans could expect a major effort, and already daily bombings indicated the pattern Guadalcanal needed at least 40 fighter aircraft capable of taking to the air at all times, and that meant 2 full squadrons with the best planes, F-4Fs or P-38SS. Also, a constant line of replacement pilots and planes must be established to counteract an attrition rate of 3 or 4 fighters per day. If Nimitz wanted Guadalcanal to be held, then the air reinforcements must be delivered without delay. If not, Guadalcanal could not be supplied, and it would fall to the Japanese for weeks. Nimitz had been reading Admiral Gormley's muddy messages about difficulties, but Gorley, who had still not visited Guadalcanal, obviously did not understand the real problem. So convinced was he that the whole Guadalcanal adventure was a ghastly mistake. McCain's strident message came on top of the visit from Under Secretary of the Navy Forrestal. If the American people knew what a dreadful mess existed down in the South Pacific, Forrestal had said there would be a revolution at home. The Marines on Guadalcanal must have planes, and they must have them fast by the time McCain reached Guadalcanal. Forrestal was already hurrying back to Washington, where he started buttonholing admirals and Army Air Corps generals to secure the aid. Ironically, Admiral Fletcher provided the needed planes within a matter of hours. Since the Battle of August 23 to 24, the Japanese had kept a constant submarine presence in the area south of Guadalcanal, where Admiral Fletcher was operating. 13 Japanese submarines were deployed in the Solomons, and 9 of them cruised south during the battle. Lieutenant Turner Caldwell had bombed the I-17, but without effect, and Lieutenant Stockton Strong and Enan John Ritchie had bombed the I-19 with the same results from the Japanese point of view. It was a bad scare, but from the American viewpoint close meant no cigar. The anti-submarine technique of Fletcher's task force left something to be desired. After the battle, there were several reported sightings of submarines, and one definite one, in which 2 planes from the Wasp unsuccessfully attacked a submarine in the pre-dawn hours of August 31st. A radar man aboard the carrier Saratoga saw a blip on his screen. Then it disappeared, as the reflected signal of a submarine travelling on the surface would do. When the vessel dived, the destroyer Farragut was sent to the contact point, but her crew saw nothing and the sonar heard nothing. Actually, the blip was the Japanese submarine marine CE-26. Commander Minoru Yokota had taken her here from Yokosuka Naval Base when the combined fleet came south, and he had been scouting for the fleet during the battle a few days before. Now he was hunting at 6 o'clock in the morning. The crew of the Saratoga was aroused after a quiet night, and the men went to battle stations. Admiral Fletcher was patrolling at 13 knots in a rectangle 150 miles long and 60 miles wide south of Guadalcanal, really just staying in the area since there was nothing there to be done. About an hour after sunrise, the carrier changed course from northwest to southeast, which took her back across that early morning contact. For some reasons, no one thought to check out that area with destroyers before the heavy ships moved in. The day's routine began, and the men went to breakfast and looked forward to another dull day, since the task force was not involved in the desperate struggle to keep the Guadalcanal lifeline. Open, and as the men of the Saratoga ate, Commander Yokota raised the periscope of I-26 and looked around. He had been sitting quietly in the same area since that early morning scare when the destroyer had come over now. Before his eyes appeared a carrier and a battleship escorted by several cruisers and destroyers. He snapped the handles of the periscope, the shears went down, and the I-26 began working carefully into position for a shot just below the surface. It took Commander Yokota many sightings first. He had to estimate the zigzag pattern of the task force, and then he had to get into position. He worked up to a position on the edge of the destroyer screen and fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier, just as Yokota fired the destroyer. McDonough made contact with the I-26 and came charging up to attack. Lookouts sighted the periscope 30 feet off the bow. Commander Yokota dropped the periscope and dived, and the destroyer's keel scraped the superstructure of I-26 as the I-boat went down. McDonough made the submarine warning signal and dropped 2 depth charges, but the excitement was so intense that no one remembered to arm them, so they went tumbling down into the deep to explode uselessly at the critical pressure point hundreds of fathoms below. Aboard the Saratoga captain, Dit Ramsey received the submarine alarm, just as a lookout sighted a purposing torpedo. He turned hard right and rang up full speed, but Commander Yock had fired a full spread of 6 torpedoes, fanning out to catch the carrier in a turn, and 2 minutes later one struck just below the island. The explosion wounded a dozen men, including Admiral Fletcher, but none of them seriously. One fire room was flooded, and the ship developed a slight list. But that was soon corrected, and the real problem was in the carrier's electrical system. The explosion had shorted out the ship's 2 main electrical generators, and the Saratoga was virtually dead in the water. In a few moments it took a full 8 hours before the electricians could repair the damage enough to give the carrier about a third of her normal speed. In the meantime there was no more carelessness about submarines and the destroyers. Phelps, MCD and Monson were detailed to go after the submarine. They dropped many depth charges, but the I-26 was lying low, engines stopped. The Monson was left behind to continue the harassment, and the cruiser. Minneapolis took the carrier in tow. The carrier Saratoga, which had been hit by a torpedo 7 months before, was out of action in the South Pacific, which left the Americans with 2 carriers. Once again, Captain Ramsey worried about his aircraft, since the carrier was a prime target for any passing submarine, and he secured permission from Fletcher to fly them off to Espiritu Santo for safety. There they were dispatched without delay to Henderson Field, and that is how General Vandergrift got another 20 fighters and 9 dive bombers. His prayers were answered that day. 3 of the new F-4F pilots of Marine Air Group 23 were lost on their first mission because their oxygen masks leaked and they fell unconscious and crashed into the sea on September 1st, as the Japanese prepared for a major effort to retake Guadalcanal. There were only 26 fighters and 30 dive bombers on Henderson Field. The attrition rate was growing because of enemy action equipment shortages and lack of training in those early days at Guadalcanal. The tiny air force was greatly assisted, possibly even made viable, by the Australian Coast Watching Network, and by August 15 the system was working effectively. Watchers Red and Mason picked up the Japanese when they passed over Banville shortly after they had taken off. D.G. Kennedy caught them as they approached New Georgia 45 minutes out from Henderson Field. 3 other coast watchers sat on a 4,000 feet mountain on Guadalcanal, and on a clear day could see them coming down the slot. Watchers on Sao Mvel, Lezella, Columbangara and Renova were also ready to report. Australian Navy Lieutenant Hugh Mackenzie arrived at Longer Point a week after the Marines with his assistant. Pointed directly at Admiral McCain, Turner was strong in his defence of McCain, but Turner's neck might well be next on the block, and King was obdurate. He wanted a change in command. So Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, commander of the Lexington Task Group at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was sent down to run the land-based air program, and Admiral McCain was sent back to Washington to become chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, which would give Admiral King a good chance to look him over too, before deciding whether to send him out to pasture or back to battle back on Guadalcanal. The Marines were lucky the weather was stormy during the first few days of September. The bad weather helped the Japanese at night as they brought up their troop reinforcements by destroyer and landing barge, but it helped the Americans by day because the Japanese could not launch the usual bombing raids on September 4th. The admirals and generals met aboard Admiral Gormley's flagship in Noumea Harbour. Admiral Gormley gave a gloomy prediction for the future, and General MacArthur's aides suggested that it would be much smarter to abandon Guadalcanal and throw United States, might MacArthur's against New Guinea from Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet. Let it be known that the prospects of getting more ships and even more planes were slim at that moment, so the American conference ended without solving any problems, and General Vandergrift was left with his troops on the island, not knowing how much help to expect, or when General Geiger did not know when his handful of planes would be augmented. Admiral Turner, apologizing for failing to give Vandergrift adequate support, could not promise when he was going to get supplies in, or where he would find the ships to protect his supply operations. At the same time the Japanese were holding similar conferences aboard Admiral Yamamoto's flagship in True Harbor. Out of them came a combined operational plan for the seizure of Guadalcanal, and the destruction of the American forces on the ground. General Kawaguchi Force was to strike against the Marines. Kawaguchi then had a total of 880,000 men on the island, against the 177,000 Marines, but the Japanese were still very hazy about the size of the American force, Because the Americans occupied so small an area, it would have seemed obvious to the Japanese, not knowing the desperate supply situation, that if the United States commander had many troops, he would long since have taken every point of the island against the tiny garrison that existed on August 7th. The Japanese attack was planned as a combined land, air, and naval assault on the island, and General Kawaguchi intended to seize the airfield on September 12th. The 11th Air Fleet would put up every plane, and the combined fleet would make an all-out assault on the waters around Guadalcanal to wipe out any United States naval forces that might be in the area in these early days of September. The daylight hours on Guadalcanal definitely belonged to the Americans. During the day the Marines patrolled their perimeter. American small craft moved back and forth across the Sound, carrying troops' messages and supplies from Tulagi to Guadalcanal. The Cactus Air Force held control of the sky, but at night Guadalcanal became a different island. Japanese troops moved around the edges of the American perimeter and engaged in fights just often enough to keep the Marines on their toes. Japanese destroyers and barges came down the slot and deposited their reinforcements, and then the destroyers usually lobbed a few shells into Henderson Field, or against one of the Marine strongpoints Japanese submarines came along the shore to shell. And one night, the Marine beach watchers claimed to have seen 3 different Japanese submarines off Savu Island. The repeated presence of the enemy submarines convinced General Vandegrift that Japanese troops on Savo Island were sending them signals. He decided to send a reconnaissance in force, which meant a large patrol to discover the enemy and, if possible, wipe them out too. Do this job, Vandegrift selected part of Colonel Red Mike Edson's 1st Raider Battalion, and Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Griffith would lead the troops. They embarked in the destroyer transports Little and Gregory on the afternoon of September 3rd. The plan was to land on the northern end of Savo Island, one group going east and the other west, until they met at the southern tip of the island. That meant a long hike, because the island was 9 miles from its northern to southern extremity. They expected to finish the job by mid-afternoon if they did not encounter any Japanese. The ships reached Savo Island on the morning of September 4th and landed the Marines. They came in by landing craft, half expecting to be greeted by the popping of Japanese machine guns. But there was no sound, and when they hit the beach and moved up, they found no Japanese. They came to a village of bamboo and thatch huts amid a palm grove, and they found the villagers there, the men in loincloths, and most of them with red hair which they created with lime juice dye. Were there any Japanese on the island? Their Australian guide asked the headman in "Pigeon me fella look, Jay's man." Said the Australian guide, and no Japanese man. Island, said the headman. From time to time there had been Japanese on the island. The headman said most recently 5 days earlier. But they had gone, so the raiders, each unit with a native guide, set out to circle the island and find out for themselves about the Japanese. And they passed through several villages on the beach. They found masses of phloem, the debris of the Battle of Savo Island lifebelts, oil drums and life rafts cluttered along the oil-stained high tide line. They found a notebook that had belonged to an officer on the Atoria crates marked Australia, and a life raft marked Quincy. They heard engines and looked up. The planes were American for a change, bombers heading toward the Japanese base at Banville. Finally, the 2 groups of Marines met at the southern tip of Savu Island. There was no sign of Japanese here either. They got into the boats that had come down to meet them, and then the ships, the Little and the Gregory, took them to Guadalcanal. They arrived at Lure Point late in the afternoon, and by the time the Marines were ashore it was dark. Usually under such circumstances, the 2 destroyer transports would move across to the sheltered harbour of Tulagi, but the weather had grown foul and the night was dark. Commander Hugh Hadley, the commander of the 2 destroyers, decided to patrol off Lunga Point that night again, on the night of September 4th. The Japanese ran the Tokyo Express to land troops. This time the barges were accompanied by the destroyers Udachi Muramo and Hatsui, which, as usual, were also ordered to shell Henderson Field and Lunga Point the Little, and the Gregory were off the Guadalcanal shore just after midnight. When the Japanese came through the channel, the Japanese ships opened fire on the Guadalcanal beach to create a diversion behind which the landing barges could put their troops ashore at Taiyu Point the Little, and the Gregory came to action stations and moved up for battle. and on their radar screens they saw several distinct blips. But just as they moved, a Peabody pilot flying over the Sound saw the gun flashes from the Japanese destroyers and assumed that another submarine was harrying the beachhead, as the submarines had been doing for a week. He decided to show up the enemy vessel and dropped a string of 5 flares half a mile ahead of the American destroyers. The light made the American ships perfect targets for the Japanese, and the 2 American destroyer transports had been selected for their particular task because they were old and underarmed by modern standards. The Little had 1 4-in gun, some 20 guns and machine guns. The Gregor's armament was similar, and the Japanese destroyers were armed with 5-in guns mounted in dual batteries. After a few aiming shots, the Japanese salvos began to strike the American ships. 1 shell knocked out the Little's 1 4-in gun, and another hit a fuel tank, and the ship burst into flame. Soon she was in desperate shape, and Lieutenant Commander G.B. Lofberg, her captain, decided to beach her, but another Japanese shell caused the steering to jam, and one struck the bridge and killed Divisional Commander Hadley and Captain Lofberg. The ship was ablaze, and her steam lines were ruptured, as the men abandoned ship and the Japanese destroyers turned their attention to the Gregory. She took 1 5-in salvo after another until the bridge was gone. Then, after stack, fell a boiler burst, and the ship was afire from one end to the other. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Harry Bower, was wounded, and he gave the order to abandon ship and was assisted into the water. But when he heard a sailor crying for help, he sent his rescuers to find the man, and he drowned. For half an hour the Japanese continued to fire on the floating blazing hulks, and then, sure that they had finished the job, they retired at high speed, leaving many men and corpses floating in the water. It was hot until daybreak that any sort of organized rescue could be started. And here again was proof that the night belonged to the Japanese every day, that the weather permitted. The Betty bombers came over from Rabaul at high altitude and bombed Henderson Field. The American fighters, warned by the coast watchers, were there to meet them, and their Zero escorts, the Americans exacted a toll from the bombers and Zeros, and the Japanese shot down some American planes. It was a war of constant deadly attrition, and had grown grating on the nerves of both sides. Admiral Ugaki Yamamoto's chief of staff wrote in exasperation in his diary, "It's infuriating. We shoot them down and we shoot them down, but they only send in more at midnight on September 3rd. The Japanese shelled the island, and the Marines retaliated with an airstrike that strafed boats and barges off Taiyu Point." On September 4th, the Cactus Air Force spotted nearly 50 boats and landing craft off Santa Isabel Island land and attacked, but the Japanese kept pouring into Guadalcanal every night by the hundreds and thousands. By September 6th, the Japanese had caught onto the American naval patrol habits and were starting their barge runs in late afternoon, just after the last American patrol headed homeward at night. They operated with impunity, Admiral Gawley wrote in despair, and he called for more help to bomb the Japanese in the Buin area, but Admiral McCain replied that he could not use the TBFs at his Spirit to Santo as Gormley wished, because they had to be kept loaded with torpedoes, in case the Japanese fleet came down again. Otherwise the whole northern sector was left defenceless on September 5th. 2 B-7S attacked the retiring Udachi Hatsu Yaki and Murakumo as they headed back to the shortlands. But without effect that day, the Cactus Air Force Patrol sighted 15 large enemy landing boats, each carrying 75 men, as the boats approached the northwest comber of Guadalcanal. The Japanese had made the mistake of trying once more to operate. During the hours of daylight, the United States planes gave the landing boats a thorough working over. They came down, strafing, and sank 3 boats. The P-400S were in their element that day, strafing and bombing along the beach, and they killed scores of Japanese soldiers and sank most of the 12 remaining boats at noon. That day came the daily Japanese air raid, this time 26 bombers and 20 Z fighters. Many of the American planes were still busy attacking the landing craft, so the F-4F response was slighter than usual. But 18 planes rose in the air to meet the Japanese. They shot down 2 bombers and a Zero, but 2 F-4Fs were lost. 1 had been destroyed on the beach, and 3 more were badly damaged. and that day a PBI shot down a Kawanishi flying boat near Guadalcanal. Every day the Japanese soldiers came in their landing barges 1,000 or 2,000 at a time. General Vandergrift could see that the enemy was building successfully for a counterattack. It was impossible for the Marines to estimate the number of Japanese who had come in counting. Landing barges was not accurate, because some came in by destroyer, and some landing barges returned during the night to Thousand Ships Bay on Santa Isabel Island for new loads. All General Vandergrift could do was increase the vigilance of the Marines. Vandergrift had asked for reinforcement, and by juggling Gawley and Turner had been able to increase his force slightly. General Kawaguchi and Admiral Yamamoto were blissfully unaware of the size of this American force even now, although the Japanese troops on the island knew that there were a great many Americans, and that if the Japanese stirred past their perimeter, they were ambushed nearly every time, as September moved into its second week. Both sides were growing nervous. General Huake was prepared to move an entire division into Guadalcanal, but General Kawaguchi, who had been on hand for a week, assured headquarters that he had enough troops at the end of the first week in September to retake the airfield, and that was the important point once Henderson Field was restored to Japanese control. It would make no difference how many Americans lurked in the jungle, they could be routed out one by one and exterminated. Since his arrival at the end of August, General Kawaguchi had been preparing for the great attack on Henderson Field. He planned to send troops against all three sides of the marine perimeter around the airfield, and cap the attack with an amphibious assault that would be led in by the warships on the day of battle. The jungle around Henderson Field was virtually impenetrable, which meant that except for the established trails which the Americans held in ambush, the Japanese had to hack their own roads through the jungle. Kawaguchi engineers did this in the first few days of September. Oddly enough, despite the daily reports of land, General Vander was as uncertain about the real strength of the Japanese as General Kawaguchi was about the Americans. Solomon Islander scouts reported to the Allies that there were several thousand Japanese in the main body, but until the coming of the war, Solomon Islanders' counting had been notable for its brevity. Very seldom was there occasion to count anything larger than could be done on two hands. So while the Melanesians were correct in their estimate, the Marines discounted it and operated aided on the principle that the Japanese reinforcements could not number more than 500 to deal with this group that was heading for a point south of Henderson Field. General Vandergrift brought Colonel Edson's 1st Raider Battalion, and the remains of the 1st Parachute Battalion that had borne the brunt of the fierce fighting on Gavutu. They were assigned to make a raid behind the Japanese lines and eliminate the Japanese threat. On September 7th, these troops boarded the destroyer transports Macken and Manly and 2 landing craft, and at dawn the next morning were taken east of Taiyu Point into the Japanese territory, and they landed and began moving toward the village of Tasimboko. As they started, they discovered a new 37 mm gun with ammunition almost on the edge of the beach, and could not understand why it had been left there. The fact was that the Japanese had just landed another contingent of troops and weapons the night before the Marines arrived, and at the time that the Marines came in towards shore, a small convoy of American supply ships were moving toward Lunga Point. The Japanese got the idea that the Americans were launching a major invasion from the sea, panicked and fled into the interior. For the moment this seemed to be a godsend, but in fact Kawaguchi was in touch with Yamamoto's headquarters, and the result of this misapprehension was to step up the Japanese time schedule for the assault on Guadalcanal. The first Japanese effort was to launch a major airstrike that morning, and the Marine Greens moved ahead up the trail. They found another new 37 mm gun and more supplies scattered along the trail, evidence of hurried evacuation. As usual, the Japanese bomber parade arrived. But it was not really so usual, for this was one of the largest raids yet staged, and a direct reaction from Rabaul to the news of the Edson raid. But luckily for the Marines, the Japanese were turned away from Henderson Field by bad weather. The raiders moved around the perimeter of what was obviously an old Japanese camp on the beach. They encountered one group of soldiers still at their landing boats, and the Americans opened fire by 9 o'clock in the morning. The Marines were engaged at several points, and it soon became clear that there were more Japanese and better armed Japanese than Vandergrift's headquarters had anticipated. The Americans were under fire from 90 mm mortars and 74 mm field guns, and the Marines called for and got help from overhead. The CACT Air Force put up a succession of dive bombers and P-400S, and they bombed and strafed to relieve the pressure on the raiders. At noon it began to rain, which churned the dusty airstrip at Henderson Field into a platter of mud. The planes continued to shuttle back and forth, however, gassing arming and taking off again to bomb and strafe around Taiyu Point and Tassim Bu, where the Marines were in trouble that afternoon. The mud caused 6 plane casualties, although no pilots were injured, but at the end of the day, 6 of the 16 fighters had been lost and 2 others damaged. The Japanese did all they could to support their men in the Tassimo fight. They sent 12 seaplanes from their base at New Georgia to bomb Henderson Field, but they were stopped by the weather and bombed Targhee instead, which was hard on the supply system, but did not affect the day's operations. After some heavy fighting, in which the Marines captured a number of 75 mm guns, they moved into TUS Bu and discovered they had come upon a Japanese headquarters. They found a radio station there which they destroyed and dumps of ammunition and food. It was apparent that the enemy had been landing supplies as well as men. For the past 10 days the raiders burned the supplies they found and moved back to the beach. They re-embarked in their destroyer transports and went back to headquarters to report they had suffered 2 men killed and 4 wounded in the raid, and had killed 30 Japanese. That night the Japanese sent a cruiser and 8 destroyers down the slot to wipe out the ships that had brought the Marines to Tassim Boko. They did not find them, but they bombarded Tulagi Harbour and destroyed 1 patrol boat and wounded several men studying the documents Edson had captured at Toimoko and the terrain from Lunga Point back beyond the airstrip. General Vandergrift noted a grassy ridge south of Henderson Field that could command the field it ran at right angles to Henderson Field and could serve as a point of assault. Vandergrift decided this place must be defended, and he assigned Colonel Edson's combined unit of raiders and parachute troops to the task, and they moved up and dug in along the ridge. The 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment was sent to defend the bank of the Tanaru River, which snaked its way inland for 2 miles. On the west, the perimeter was defended by another line of Marines and northwest. Of the ridge, 2 pockets were placed at strong points, one manned by men of the 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalion, and the other by the 1st Pioneers Construction Battalions. The fact that Vandergrift had to use specialists as infantrymen showed how thin the perimeter was. In spite of the number of troops, he was not overly worried, however, because Marines were trained first as infantrymen before they adopted specialties. Vandergrift had 4 days to prepare, although no one was sure of the Japanese intentions. Admiral Gormley's information indicated the Japanese might swoop down on Guadalcanal on the night of September 8th with cruisers and destroyers. The threat was real enough to have him call the destroyer transports Fuller and Bellatrix away from the beach. Before they were through unloading a slender string of supplies, he sent them eastward to avoid trouble on September 9th. General Giger reported that his pilots were nearly exhausted, and although he was driving them, it's better to keep flying than get a bayonet stuck up them. The results of their flying were showing in mistakes and damaged aircraft. At least part of the reason for the heavy aircraft loss on the muddy field on September 8th had been pilot exhaustion. The flight surgeon told Geiger that most of his pilots were unfit to fly, their nerves ragged from lack of sleep and their judgment impaired by exhaustion. Some of the pilots who had been assiduous before showed their combat fatigue in a growing unwillingness to fly. Major Robert Geyer of Fighting 224 Carry characterized his own squadron and 2 others as almost worthless, except for Captains Marion Carl and John Dobbin, who seemed to be iron men. The pilots flew because they had to, and they went up dazed and they came back exhausted, and many of them opted out of fights if possible. On September 9th, the CBBs finished up a new airstrip, the cow pasture 1.25 miles east of Henderson Field. From that point on, the lighter fighters would take off and land on this strip, leaving the bigger one for that heavier bombers. Initially, the improvement made little difference on September 9th. The Japanese sent over another large force of Betty bombers. The tempo had been stepped up with that call for help from Toimoko, and at Rabaul the Japanese still were certain the Americans had made another major troop landing. The Japanese attack was directed mainly against the shipping. In the Sound, the Marine fighters shot down 5 bombers and 3 Zeros. But the extent of the fatigue was shown again. Captain Marion Carl, the 12-plane A, did not return. The day ended with 4 more fighters gone and 3 pilots wounded or missing on September 10th. The Bettys were back again in force with 15 Zeros to guard them. The Americans claimed 5 Japanese planes, but by the end of that day only 12 F-4Fs were operational that day. All the planes that had come off Saratoga were ordered to Guadalcanal. Also on September 10th, Gormley's headquarters announced that a Japanese task force was coming to Guadalcanal and could be expected to arrive by the 12th. No one was quite sure how large this force was. The reports spoke only of cruisers and destroyers. Admiral Yamamoto was being extremely careful to conceal from the Americans the whereabouts and number of his available carriers. His officers and the army officers tended to disparage the Americans, but Yamamoto had warned them against underestimating the enemy. The Americans thought there might be as many as 7 Japanese carriers operating in the area, and later on the 10th Naval Intelligence gave a new estimate. It was enough to frighten anyone. There were 7 carriers, 3 or 4 battleships, 8 or 9 heavy cruisers, 5 or 6 light cruisers, 20 or more destroyers, and seaplane tenders and transports capable of carrying 25,000 troops on the 11th. The Bettys came again at the usual time with their Zero escort. This time the Cactus Air Force was slight bish, and before they could be intercepted, the Bettys had dropped a pattern of bombs in the service area on the east side of Henderson Field, causing 20 casualties and destroying 1 P-400. The commanding officer of the 67th Army Air Force Fighter Squadron was one of the injured who had to be evacuated. The F-4FS came in trailing glory. They had shot down half a dozen bombers and fighters, but another United States pilot had been shot out of the sky and swam for shore, and another F-4F was gone. Now there were 11 F-4Fs, but the Japanese at Rabaul had 4 times as many fighters, plus dozens of bombers, and the seaplanes at New Georgia, that estimate was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 4:30 a.m. the Cactus Air Force was augmented by 24 F-4Fs from the Saratoga Fighting 5. The fighter squadron of Air Group 5, which was aboard the carrier back at Newer Admiral Gormley, again warned Admiral King that he would have to expect this of attrition for months to come, and asked for a constant supply of aircraft capable of fighting in the conditions of the Pacific. The Army Air Force had suggested that the P-40 was an adequate airplane, but the pilots in the field quite disagreed. Besides, there weren't any P-4S or anything else available for Guadalcanal. Just at that time, General Vandergrift had pleaded once more with Admiral Turner for reinforcement, but Turner had replied that the only possible force would be the 7th Marines at Samoa, who had had no amphibious training. They would need at least a month to prepare. And to Vandergrift, just then, a month was a lifetime turn. Anew he told Gurley that day that in his opinion the situation of the Guadalcanal landings was perilous. Gormley in turn sent a message to Admiral Nimitz that day's situation. As I view it today, extremely critical. What Gormley knew, of course, was all second-hand information, and he still had not visited Guadalcanal, although that very day Admiral Turner was going to see how bad it really was. The Gurley report was accurate enough, and the food situation at Guadalcanal that day was critical. The Japanese air and sea strikes had grown increasingly effective against the American convoys coming from Numa. The air raids every day, and sometimes more than once a day, disrupted the unloading of the United States transports. The carrier task force had been reduced to 2 carriers, the Wasp and the Hornet, and Gormley had to be brought into Guadalcanal to give the weary Marines already in the line some rest. But this could not be done disregarding training for at least a few days in the interim. The Marines would have to hold no matter what happened. And as for the Cactus Air Force, McCain was doing everything possible to beg and borrow planes, and he would even steal them if he could find them. As far as Turner was concerned, he proposed to go back to Espiritu Santo, board his flagship, and return to Guadalcanal with supplies in the transports, plus the 7th Marine Regiment. This move would be covered by all the warships and carriers that the fleet could produce. Turner and McCain were asleep at Vandergrift's headquarters when the Japanese bombardment began. That was the end of sleep. The Kawaguchi Brigade began at daylight on September 12th to probe the marine defences along the southern line. Kawaguchi, like General Vandergrift, had seen that the ridge south of Henderson Field was the most logical point of attack, since it would give the Japanese a sort of driveway with dense jungle on both sides. With luck, they might come down the ridge straight at the airfield and take control. One Japanese detachment broke through the line that day, surrounded a force of Marines and cut off communications, but the Marines held in their pocket, and the Japanese did not launch the major attack expected, and on top of the ridge the raiders had dug in. Some of them did not much like digging in the rock they found just below the surface, but an air raid that plastered the ridge with bombs from a number of Betty bombers killed several Marines whose foxholes were inadequate, and the rest learned just before noon the Bettys arrived as usual, and this time the Marine anti-aircraft guns destroyed 2 bombers, and another was damaged and shot down later by a fighter. The Marines and Navy claimed 10 bombers and 3 Zeros that day. But the 42 plane bombing raid had done damage. 1 bomb hit the radio shack at the airport and cut off communications from Guadalcanal for 4.5 hours late on the afternoon of September 12th. The dive bombers of Scouting Squadron 3 went on their usual late patrol. This time they found the Northern Solomons dotted with the grey shapes of Japanese warships. One pilot reported a cruiser and 3 destroyers 40 miles off Rendova. Another found a destroyer off Schwaza, and another found more destroyers off Santa Isabel. These ships were the cruiser Tenyu, and her destroyers coming in to open the combined assault that was to secure the airfield for the Japanese. The Marines scattered the planes around the field as well as they could. In order to protect them, the combined fleet was behind these ships, waiting for word that General Kawaguchi had moved as darkness fell. Washing machine. Charlie appeared, and just before 10 p.m. so did Louis the Lay. The Guadalcanal night was lit up with ghoulish green flare light as the Japanese began their bombardment. But on this night, neither the airfield nor the Lero dumps were the prime target. General Kawaguchi had radioed to Rabaul a description of the marine dispositions, and the bombardment unit opened up. On the ridge where Colonel Edson had dug in after 20 minutes, the ships shifted their fire to the airfield and hit the Marine Scout bombing squadron camp, killing Lieutenant El Baldus, Lieutenant D.V. Rose, Lieutenant J.W. Weintraub, and wounding 2 others when the bombardment ceased. The Marines on the ridge knew what was coming. A rocket flew up red and trailing sparks from the jungle below the ridge, and it was followed by the scraping of feet and metal on rock, and Japanese shouting, "Yankee you die, drink marine blood, Bansai Tenno Hea Banzai," and the Japanese were coming. At first the fury of their drive drove back the Marines in the forward positions. The Japanese cut off the platoon on the right flank, and then tried to encircle it on the left. They drove holes in the line held by the parachute troops, but the parachutists rallied and drove the enemy away. Marine artillery opened up from behind the Vandergrift command post, and the Japanese retreated when morning came. Colonel Edson surveyed his position and moved some for positions back to better terrain. He could see that his Marines were tired, but there were no replacements, and Major Kenneth Bailey had a bullet through the top of his helmet, but his scalp was only grazed. Edson himself was dirty bedraggled, and 2 Japanese bullets had torn through his blouse without hitting him, but Private First Class Ray Heron had been a member of a squad stationed on the south side of the ridgetop when the Japanese made charge after charge against that position. This squad was hit hard. Finally, only 4 men were on their feet. Then Heron was hit in the belly. He thought surely he was going to die, and he took a .45 automatic from one of the others and told them to retreat. He would hold off the Japanese as long as possible, he did, but he was not seen alive again. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Johnson was wounded by a grenade during the night fighting, and next morning he was taken along with other wounded to a truck for evacuation to the field hospital. The road LED down on the ridge, and below the Japanese were firing their mortars. A machine gunner somewhere on high ground also saw the truck and fired on it, wounding the driver. The truck stopped, and Johnson got out and tried to start it. It would not start. He put the truck in gear and used the power of the battery and starter to propel the truck jerkily for 300 yards out of range of the Japanese gunner. Then he got the truck started and drove to the field hospital. Johnson let out the wounded, and felt so much better that he went back for another load, and the wounded had to be moved, but the unwounded had to stay on. Edson knew that the night would bring an even more violent attack, and the morning of September 13th was quiet on the ground in the air. It was a different matter. Admirals McCain and Turner prepared to leave the field, but were delayed when the coast watchers reported enemy planes on the night of September 12th. Admiral Yamamoto had expected General Kawaguchi to take the airfield as planned, but by dawn on September 13th, Yamamoto had no word from the army. But this was not unusual, because the two services never had learned to cooperate. Yamamoto ordered the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul to send a scouting mission to Henderson Field to see if it was in Japanese hands. As expected, 2 observation planes guarded by 20 Zeros were assigned to the mission if they saw that all was well. They were to land at Guadalcanal. The Zeros arrived over Henderson Field early in the morning, but to their surprise were met by a swarm of F-4Fs just minutes before 18. New F-4Fs had been brought to Henderson Field from the carrier Hornet. For once there were plenty of planes available for the work at hand. The presence of the F-4FS gave the Japanese observation planes their answer. The American planes attacked, and only 17 of the Zeros went home. But once again the Marines and Navy had their losses. 1 United States pilot was shot down, 2 others were wounded, and 2 F-4Fs were lost and 1 badly damaged. Admirals Turner and McCain flew off just before the noon air raid, and 10 minutes later the Bettys and Zeros appeared, as if responding to a cue. The attrition of recent days had obviously caused the Japanese to bring in new untried pilots. They were supposed to attack American artillery positions, but when the leader saw Marine anti-aircraft fire begin puffing up around his wings, he dropped his bombs on the Japanese concentrations at Taiyu Point. Others followed suit, and the damage to the Japanese was considerable. 1 Betty pilot did put his stick of bombs in precisely the right place along the ridge line, but the Marines were lucky and no one was hit. The American fighters shot down 5 Japanese bombers from that contingent. From the beginning, the Marines and Navy flyers had been told not to try to dogfight with the Zeros on a 101 basis, because the Japanese planes were so much faster and more maneuverable. As long as the Americans kept the 2-plane unit each protecting the tail of the other, they fared well, but on this day perhaps intoxicated by their having received so many brand-new F-4F fighters. Captain John Smith's fighter pilots made the fatal mistake of mixing at close hand with the enemy war correspondents Robert Miller of the United Press Associations, and Richard Tracis of the International News Service had gone down to the Cucum camps at Longer Point that morning, and there they got a worm's-eye view of the aerial show the Japanese fighters had been instructed to strafe the Americans. And like the bombers, they had mistaken Taiyu Point for Longer Point, and were strafing their own troops at the Tassim Boko command post when the F-4Fs jumped them for the Zeros. It was a quick pull on the stick and an increase in power, and they were up climbing fast and turning the approved American technique called for the 2 pilots of an F-4F2 plane section to stick together, turn, gain altitude, and make another pass at the Zeros from above. Thus the superior diving ability of the F-4F could be brought into play, but the combat deteriorated into dogfights, and the result was disastrous. For all but the most experienced pilots, the cumulus clouds towered white and solid above Iron Bottom Sound, and the island and the correspondents and the Marines in their foxholes had a great show as. The F-4Fs and Zeros circled and darted in and out of the clouds, trying to get gain advantage and get on the tail of an enemy. The machine guns rattled incessantly, as loud and magnificent as thunder, wrote correspondent Tracis. We saw 1 Wildcat F-4F come diving down like a comet from the clouds. Wrote Tracis with 2 Zeros on his tail. He was moving faster than they, and as he pulled out of his dive and streak across the water, he left them behind. That pilot had escaped his enemies with the speed of his dive, which they could not match. Unfortunately, in a looping turn or a climb, it was the other way around, and when the fight was over that day, Captain Smith and Lieutenant H. Phillips had each shot down a Zero, but they were old hands. They had been fighting at Guadalcanal for 23 days. 3 other United States pilots not so lucky or not so skillful were shot down, and 2 more brought F-4Fs back to Henderson Fields, so badly damaged that they were usable only for parts of the 18 brand new F-4FS fed over from the Hornet. 4 were lost even before their Bureau of Aviation numbers could be recorded on the squadron rolls. Henderson had more activity than usual that day, and late in the afternoon a pair of Japanese float planes came in fast to examine the field again. They were at 500 feet moving at top speed, and they found an American dive bomber in the landing pattern above the field and shot it down. Before the shocked eyes of the whole Cactus Air Force, the bomber crashed, burned, and exploded, killing the pilot and gunner as the Japanese float planes disappeared over the end of the runway. The Marine anti-aircraft gunners cursed themselves for being caught napping and vowed that it would not happen again when a large formation of planes appeared 10 minutes later. They were ready, and they began firing furiously as the planes came in, despite the harassment they saw the aircraft were Navy SPDs, and stopped shooting before they destroyed any planes. These also included aircraft of the unlucky carrier Saratoga, 12 dive bombers and 6 torpedo bombers. The news of the Japanese ships in the waters north of Guadalcanal and the intimations from all sides of a major attack had left General Vandergrift more than worried. On September 13th, he stopped by the pagoda, which General Geiger was using as his headquarters, as well as operations office, Yanda Gri. And Geiger had been in the Corps more than 30 years, and they were good friends. This day Vandergri told Geiger that he did not know how long they could hold the perimeter against a concentrated Japanese attack, particularly if the combined fleet came down with an amphibious landing. It might well be that the perimeter would be overrun and the airfield would fall. If that seemed imminent, he would get word to Geiger, and the general should have all his planes ready to fly out to Espiritu Santo, where they would be safe. Geiger listened and nodded. He would arrange for that. He said, but as far as he was concerned personally, he would stay on and fight with Vandergrift, even if it meant a fight to the end. This sober thinking permeated the higher echelons of the Marine headquarters when the commander of the South Pacific Force gave up the battle before it was fought, and the impairment of morale was obvious. The fact was that there was no real reason for the pessimism at that particular moment. Vandergri did not know how greatly his force outnumbered the enemy, nor just how slender were the Japanese air forces at Rabaul Admiral Sukahara of the 11th Air Fleet was scraping the barrel and pleading with higher authority for more planes. He was also hampered because under the Japanese system, the Navy was totally responsible for air defense in the South Pacific, and the Army would not supply any aircraft. Admiral Gormley at least had a unified command with carrier planes, the Cactus Air Force and McCain's land-based Air Force working for him. They could call on General MacArthur for some assistance, however reluctantly given, so the Japanese air forces were as badly off as the Americans. It was only in the matter of naval strength that the Japanese were fully superior. Their base at Rabaul and support base at True were close by, whereas the Americans had to be supplied from Pearl Harbor half a world away. This, as much as the shortage of American fighting ships, was the truly serious problem of the moment at Guadalcanal, and true to his promise to help Admiral Turner was on his way to bring the 7th Marines to reinforce Guadalcanal and supply the Marines at the same time. Before he left Guadalcanal that day, he asked Gawley for permission to move, and Gawley ducked the issue. Definite approval cannot be given until present situation is known, he said, but copies of the messages went to Nimitz, and King Admiral King told Nimitz that Turner's request demanded action, and Nimitz sent a sharp message to Gormley. Turner's request is approved. Gawley roused himself then to try to recover his lost prestige, and issued orders to Turner to carry out the mission. He also warned Turner and Vandergrift that a major effort would be made on the night of September 13th by General Kawaguchi to capture the airfield that night of September 12th. As darkness fell on the ridge above Henderson Field, the Japanese began to move about after an afternoon of silence. Colonel Edson's men were dog-tired, and their effective strength was 300 men in those foxholes on the ridge behind them was General Vandergrift's command post, and behind that the reserves consisting of a battalion on under Colonel W.J. Whaling, and behind them the artillery with its guns sighted in on the crest of the ridge, and the Japanese positions to the south of it. Beyond all the soldiers lay Henderson Field, the prize the Japanese had vowed to secure, and the Marines had promised to defend. Japanese troop morale on Guadalcanal had been raised enormously by the bombardment of the night before, and the continual train of Japanese planes flying over Guadalcanal that day. That night the reinforced Japanese set out to take the airfield at any cost. As darkness fell, a red rocket shot up from the Japanese lines, and men in the forward line began screaming, "Marine, you die!" The Japanese 90 mm mortars behind the ridge coughed, and the mortar shells hummed in and exploded on the ridgeline among the Marine foxholes. The Japanese on the edge of the ridge stood up, and shouting Banzai ran forward with their bayonets firing. As they came, the Marines crouched in their foxholes and fired their rifles on semi-automatic. The popping of Browning automatic rifles was joined by the stitching sound of machine guns, the screaming, the high splat of the 25 caliber Japanese rifles, and the staccato of light Japanese machine guns. The Japanese probed the front of the ridge and got nowhere. Marines killed the enemy right up to and inside their foxholes. The Japanese moved to the right for the next assault, and on the west side of the ridge found an opening squeezed through, and in the darkness outflanked one raider company. Some of the Japanese infiltrated as far back as General Vandergrift's command post before they were shot down. Private First Class Jim Corrine saw 4 Japanese soldiers setting up a Nambo machine gun on a hilltop, and he rushed at them, bayoneted the gunner, and swung the gun around on the Japanese he fired. They fired and he fell dead, but the Japanese were either dead or wounded, and the gun was not put into action on the right flank of the Marines. The Japanese tried again to surround the forward element. Captain John Sweeney's raider company was cut to pieces in this assault. His troops numbered only a platoon at the end of the Japanese attack. Not a company major. Torgerson's parachutists also took a heavy series of attacks, and in a lull when the Tokyo Express came down again and shelled the parachutists' position was hit. Lewis, the LA, appeared over the Marine lines and dropped one of his green flares. Another red flare went up. General Kawaguchi hurled more troops against the ridge, but still the Marines held as the infantry firing, and the movement became intense. The Marine artillery opened up and fired all night long, the WP of the 105 mm howitzers, the loudest sound in the jungle. The Marine telephone lines to the ridge were cut by mortier. After that, the Marine howitzers fired at the Japanese by the light of the Japanese rockets, each of which went up over a new unit as it began to attack offshore. The cruiser Tenryu appeared again with her train of destroyers, and they began a general bombardment of Henderson Field and the battle area shortly before midnight. The Japanese along the ridge line seemed told down. Then another red flare went up, and a howling line of skirmishers headed up the ridge against the left flank of the Marines. The artillery behind the line began firing to its left, and the Japanese loaded their mortars with smoke shells and laid down a screen gas attack. The Japanese screamed and charged forward, pushing back the Marine left flank. Already the earlier attacks had pushed the right flank to the rear, where it had reformed. Now the centre company of Marines was in danger of being cut off, so they were moved back to the last line on the ridge behind was the valley, and below that, the pathway to the airfield. The Japanese were stopped by the heavy barrage from the 105 mm guns, but some men managed to come through it up the slope and hurl grenades. They attacked intermittently, unit after unit, but each was sent reeling back by 2:30 a.m. in the morning. The edge of the Japanese offensive was blunted, and the charges continued, but ever smaller and briefer. The Marine machine guns rattled, and the artillery boomed each time the Japanese moved as dawn came. The last Japanese charge sent a handful of men to the crest of the hill, where the Marines picked them up off, but an officer and 2 men reached General Vandergrift's command post before they were shot down. With morning came casualty reports, and General Vandergrift saw that the parachute battalion was down from the week before, down from 377 officers and men to 165, and the raiders from 750 men to 526. The shelling of the airfield and the Marine positions had been a cover once more for a Japanese troop landing, and 1,700 troops of a 17th Army detachment had joined General Kawaguchi. but too late to be included in the last night's battle. He would need them. He had sent 2,000 men against the Marine lines that night, and more than 600 had been killed and 500 wounded as the sun rose in the sky, and the birds began to sing as if there had been no bloodletting the night before the Marines counted noses that night 40 Marines had been killed, and 100 had wounded on the ridge, and a few others had been killed and wounded. Along the rest of the perimeter, the Japanese had staged lesser attacks on the bank of the Tanaru River against Colonel Mell's force, and another Japanese detachment circling around in the jungle, and thus arriving very late, had attacked on the other flank, where Colonel Beebe's 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marines dealt with them swiftly and mercilessly, aided by 75 pack howitzers. As the morning sun rose along the ridge, General Geiger sent every available plane into the air too. Bomb and Strafe, the 3 remaining operational army puns, were admirably suited for this work, and they flashed in low over the ground, attacking too low as it turned out, because 2 of the fighters were hit by accurate Japanese ground fire and were forced back to the field, their engines out to make dead-stick landings. There was no quarter in this war, and the Japanese bodies, 500 at least, lay in grotesque positions around the ridge, and on top of it the insects moved in, and the heat began to bloat the corpses. Before noon the Japanese made no attempt to brave the ridge in daylight, but under General Kawaguchi orders began to retreat to the headquarters established on the Matanikau River west of Lunga Point. They had to cut a trail through the jungle as they went, and many of the wounded did not survive the rigours of the journey on the ridge. Colonel Edson's exhausted R moved back while Marines from the reserve advanced to handle the mowing up small pockets of Japanese had infiltrated the lines and been caught by daylight, and they sniped and tried to move back as the Marines came up that day. At one point, correspondent Traces heard a strange foreign shout and then a burst of shooting. He walked up to the ridge and found 2 dead Japanese and a dead Marine. 3 Japanese had been flushed out and made a bayonet charge. The sounds Traces had heard were the cries of Banzai by the Emperor's soldiers as they launched this suicide charge. 1 Japanese had caught the Marine and spitted him, and was then shot by other Marines, and the 2nd Japanese had been tackled and then shot. A 3rd had gotten away into the jungle, and the rest of the day was similar to that the Marines moved carefully, but the snipers still caused casualties and had to be flushed out and killed. It took another 24 hours before the ridge returned to quiet, and the Marines named the ridge. Then, in the fashion of American fighting men, Bloody Ridge they called it, and Bloody Ridge it would always be in the annals of the Marines, long after the Pacific War ended. The myth persisted in America that the Japanese submarine force had accomplished virtually nothing during the war, but the facts were quite the reverse. The Japanese submarines, and particularly the big I-bots, which were superior to the American fleet class. Submarines in many respects were real menace to the American fleet, and particularly to the American carriers. By the time of the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Saratoga had been torpedoed twice, put out of action each time, and the Yorktown had been sunk by a submarine. The men of the United States Navy did not share the popular belief of the press, but at the beginning of the war, the Navy's anti-submarine tactics were ineffective as of December 7, 1941. A chief petty officer was in charge of anti-submarine warfare in Washington, the sinking of the Yorktown, and the 2 torpedoes that struck the Saratoga were largely the result of poor protective tactics, which were demonstrated by the carrier forces' inability to sink any of the several submarines that shadowed the task force during the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. One reason that Admiral Fletcher was so gun-shy could be traced to his fear that one of his carriers would be torpedoed, and this belief in the fragility of carriers was shared by Admiral Gawley, who was also reluctant to expose the carrier force to danger on September 14th. However, there was no recourse but to expose the carriers. In spite of Gormley's reluctance, Admiral Turner had been given the green light by Admiral Nimitz to supply and reinforce the American beachhead on Guadalcanal. There was no way to protect the transports, except by committing the American carriers and surface warships, since the Cactus Air Force was unable to build reserves in the war of attrition at 6 o'clock on the morning of September 14th. Admiral Turner sailed the 7th Marine Regiment was aboard 6 transports, and they were escorted by all the cruisers and destroyers that Germany would let go far to the south was the task force. Encounters with the cream of the Japanese naval air fleets, but the rate of attrition had been so great that the new group of fighter and bomber pilots seemed to be as fresh from the assembly lines as their planes around Bloody Ridge. The Marines spent 3 days mopping up. After the big battle, the snipers were the worst problem for having been trapped behind the American lines. They had no real recourse by their standards, but to fight to the death and make every shot count as long as they lived. So the Marines had to keep scouting and clearing out the trees, and they suffered a certain number of casualties and much more inconvenience south of Guadalcanal. The Hornet and the Wasp were cruising, and the Wasp was surrounded by 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers a few miles away. Was the Hornet accompanied by the battleship North Carolina 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers. On the morning of September 15th, the Combat Air Patrol shot down a Carnan 4-engine flying boat, but since the big plane was far beyond visual range of the force and had been detected by radar, no one worried much about having been reported to the Japanese, and also the searches indicated the combined fleet was far away on September 15th. General Kawaguchi sent a reluctant message to Rabaul and the combined fleet he had met stiff enemy opposite Toron, he said, and had to abandon the drive on the airfield aboard combined fleet flagship Yamato. The news was greeted first with disbelief and then with disappointment, and we stamped our feet in bitter anger, said one officer, and Admiral Yamamoto was no better pleased the army had completely underestimated the enemy and suffered the bitter results of that error. It would take at least a full division of troops to reinforce Guadalcanal and take the airfield until the army could supply the troops. There was no point in pursuing the action. Yamamoto turned the combined fleet back and headed for TR flight operations continued all day. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Wasp made ready to launch a new search and combat air patrol. She turned into the wind and slowed down from the 16 knots cruising speed, and she launched 18 dive bombers and 8 fighters. Admiral Noes did not know that even as the carrier launched her planes, she was being watched by one of Japan's most celebrated submarine captains. He was Commander Takashi Kinashi in the I-19, who had made his reputation in the first days of the war operating off Malaya. When Commander Kinashi spotted the task force through his periscope, he worked around until he had the Wasp group ahead of him, silhouetted against the Hornet group. That way, if he fired torpedoes and they missed the Wasp group, they would go on through and give him a second chance. Kinashi moved in as close as he could to the Wasp and fired a full-spread 6 torpedoes from the forward tubes, and 3 of the torpedo headed directly for the Wasp's course. Captain Forrest P. Sherman, the commander of the Wasp, swung into the turn demanded just then by their base course, and as he did so, lookouts warned that torpedoes were approaching the starboard beam of the ship. Sherman tried to escape by turning right again, but 3 torpedoes struck. The explosions were enormous. The flight deck bucked up and planes jumped into the air, crashed back onto the deck planes suspended in the hangar deck. Fell fire broke out in the ammunition and fuel supplies. The water M's forward burst, and the fire could not be fought with water. Captain Sherman turned the Wasp so that the flames and smoke blew after, away from the undamaged parts of the carrier the ship listed, but the engineers corrected the list and kept her going. All this activity had not really communicated the danger to the Hornet task group, so unprofessional was the American anti-submarine approach from 6 miles away. No one could fail to see the smoke and flame rising from the deck of the Wasp. But the men aboard the Hornet wondered if perhaps she had not suffered an operational accident just then, with no more warning from the protective destroyers than the Wasp. Had the Hornet came under attack from the remaining 3 torpedoes of the I-19 as commander, Kinashi had hoped the 3 that missed the Wasp ran straight on. When the torpedoes neared the Hornet group, the lookout aboard the destroyer Mustin sighted one wake and spread the alarm by voice radio and by hoisting the torpedo warning flag. But the battleship North Carolina had no time to maneuver, and 1 torpedo struck forward on the port side of the ship. It hit 20 feet below the waterline and killed 5 men instantly. A hole 32 feet long and 18 feet high was torn in the battleship side, and it seemed she must sink. Certainly one of the old battleship of the Pearl Harbor vintage would have, but the new fast battleships were constructed with many watertight compartments, and although 4 of North Carolina's compartments were flooded, the captain also flooded the nearby forward magazines for safety. The ship could still make 25 knots, and in a few minutes the damage control party adjusted ballast so that the list was gone. Commander Cashie's 5th torpedo raced across the Hornet formation, and so did the 6th, and the destroyer O'Brien was steaming off the North Carolina's quarter. One of the O'Brien's lookouts saw the 5th torpedo to port and yelled the bridge responded and swung to the right, so the fish passed just astern of the ship, but at that very second the gunnery officer spotted the 6th torpedo. It was too late to move out of the way, and the 6th torpedo struck the O'Brien in the bow and ripped it open, and it was not a mortal wound, but the O'Brien was badly hurt. So Commander Cashie had accomplished one of the rare feats of the war. He had expended 6 torpedoes and left 1 carrier burning. 1 battleship crippled and 1 destroyer crippled, her back was broken, and she sank on the way home to the United States. Commander Kinashi was not discovered, and the American destroyers rushed to and fro seeking a second submarine, but they found no clues much later. United States naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison concluded in his History of United States Naval Opera that the North Carolina and O'Brien had been hit by torpedoes from I-15. This was also assigned in that same southern area, but Admiral Morison misunderstood the Japanese use of submarines almost never. Were 2 submarines in a position to cross paths, the Japanese kept them carefully apart. Morison did suggest that it was barely possible for I-9 to have attacked both carrier groups, and in his defence it must be said that it seemed so nearly impossible that Cashie could have made such a sweep with 1 spread that any other explanation seemed more reasonable. The carrier force, moreover, was thoroughly occupied in the task of trying to save the Wasp. The fires of hell burned below her decks, and the forecastle was red-hot. No one in the wardroom at the time of explosion could have survived. It was smashed and gutted. Much of officers' country was located directly below the torpedo hits, and men in their bunks had no chance, but up forward men were alive, although cut off from the main part of the ship by fire smoke and white-hot metal on the water. A film of burning gasoline encircled the bow, and many were afraid to leap into the sea, the only possible way of saving themselves. Those who raised the courage made the jump, and some swam successfully beneath the fires. Some men also burned in fighting the fires. The major trouble was the lack of water pressure, and in the absence of it the fires gained headway. At 3 o'clock the carrier was suddenly shaken by an enormous explosion of gas that had built up below deck. The bridge and the island structure was smashed, and the fighter director office, the radar, and the air commander's cubbyhole were all wiped out on the bridge. Admiral Noyes was thrown flat on the signal deck. His clothes afire, and several officers and men on the port side of the bridge were blown overboard. The Admiral and Captain Sherman survived, and the captain made his way after to the Battle 2 station to control the rescue effort as he reached. This point, another explosion blew the No. 2 elevator out of its housing and high into the air to crash down onto the flight deck. The carrier burned fiercely, and the hangar deck was turned into a fire pit, and the ready bombs, machine gun bullets, and torpedoes began to explode after 20 more minutes of distressing effort. Captain Sherman decided that there was no hope and that the ship must be abandoned. He gave the order, and the retreat was remarkably orderly, considering the raging fires and the constant danger of explosion. The injured men were found and taken off, and chiefs searched the wreckage for survivors before leaving the ship. Mattresses, lumber life preservers, anything that would float was hurled from the deck to help the men who struggled in the water. The evacuation took an hour. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon before Captain Sherman left the ship, belatedly. The destroyers were throwing depth charges at submarines. Commander Kinashi had marvelled for a moment at his handiwork, and then slipped silently away beneath their noses. The depth charges did more harm to the survivors in the water than anything else. But after the carrier was evacuated and all the rescued were picked up by ships of the task force, the statistics showed that of the 2,250 men aboard, about 200 were killed and 375 wounded. All but one of the planes that had just flown off as the torpedo struck were able to land on the Hornet. Considering the extent of the tragedy, Admiral Noyes, Captain Sherman, and the men of the Wasp had rallied heroically if there was a lesson to be learned from the enormous damage done so easily by one submarine in the presence of 13 destroyers. There was also something to be learned about American torpedoes. A lesson that went unremarked that day the Wasp continued to bum fiercely, and Rear Admiral Norman Scott in the San Francisco, who had taken command when Admiral Noyes was in the water, ordered the destroyer Laune to torpedo and sink the carrier. The Laune fired 5 torpedoes at the Wasp, and all 5 were hits, but only 3 exploded. They did the job, and the Wasp sank that afternoon 250 miles northwest of Espiritu Santo. When Admiral Gormley received the report of the affair, he suggested that Noyes was at fault for remaining in the same area for a long period of time. The area was 300 miles east-west and 140 miles north-south, and that this hanging around had been the cause of the sinking. But when the report reached Admiral King, who had all year been experiencing the devastation of the German U-boats off the American coast, King knew better than Gurley that the fault lay in the entire American technique of dealing with submarines. Admiral Noyes could not be faulted for the errors of the past, nor could anyone else, and an investigation made by Rear Admiral John Shafroth said as much. Admiral Nimitz agreed that no one could be blamed for the loss of the Wasp, but in all this investigation, sight was lost of a matter equally important. Why did 2 United States torpedoes strike but not explode? This was one of the mysteries of the early days of the war, one that would not be solved in 1942 or the next year. At the moment, many other problems seemed far more pressing, especially the fact that as of September 15, 1942, the United States had only 1 operational carrier in the South Pacific, while as far as Admiral Nimitz knew the Japanese had 8 carriers available. The United States had 1 battleship available, the Washington, while the Japanese had 9 battleships, including the Musashi and Yamato, the most powerful ever built, and the Japanese force of cruisers and destroyers far outnumbered the American. These statistics were enough to give anyone pause. Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet was fueling on the day the Wasp was destroyed. Commander Kinashi wasted no time in surfacing well outside the American task force. He sent the word of his victory and of the course and speed of the 20 remaining warships and the Hornet, but the combined fleet carriers were too far away, and for some reason the Japanese did.